Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, what I want to discuss is one sutta from the Pali tradition where the Buddha discusses the possibility of being reborn with our spouse. Now, as background in these videos of mine, what I try to do in general is to illuminate a lot of the Dharma that we find in early Buddhism from a contemporary perspective. Now, of course, I've got my own opinions about all of these matters, and I will get to some of my opinions later on in the video, but my opinions aside, I think it's very important, at least from a scholarly and an intellectual perspective, to understand as best we can what the Buddha might have said in the early tradition. Again, if we go back as far as we can. Now, that's not always going to be possible, but we do our best. So to set the stage here a little bit, we should keep in mind that the Buddha often discussed more worldly aims when it came to his discussions with lay people. In other words, when lay people would come up and ask him questions, he wasn't pushing them towards enlightenment right away. He understood that lay people had careers, they had families, they had wealth, they had lay interests. And so he knew that to push them towards enlightenment directly would simply lose them as potential followers of the Dharma. Presumably, such lay people might pursue enlightenment in a future life. But whatever the case, he didn't always push it. Now, the sutta that I'm going to discuss today, to my knowledge, only exists in the Pali tradition. That is to say, there aren't parallels of the sutta in other associated languages that were translated out of Indic languages back in the early days. It doesn't occur in Sanskrit, so it may be a later interpolation. In other words, it may not be an early text. Or it may be that this text was lost in those other traditions for some reason, perhaps because of its lay context. It's impossible for me to say for sure. That's a matter for future scholars to determine. But in any event, in this sutta, the Buddha is approached by two people, by what's called Nakula's parents. Two people called Nakula's parents. We're never told who Nakula is, and indeed, as far as I can tell, Nakula himself is never, or actually herself, is never actually mentioned in the suttas. So take that for what it's worth. Now, in any event, both of Nakula's parents come to the Buddha and say that they have loved one another since they were very young, and that they want to remain together in the rest of this life and in the next life. So having asked this question, I think this sets up something of a turning point in this sutta. The Buddha could have explained to them the problems, the suffering, the potential suffering, the dukkha involved in these kinds of romantic relationships, as indeed is discussed in other suttas. Romantic love is, for the Buddha, one of the sort of paradigmatic examples of the sort of thing that can lead to suffering. As we lose our partner, as we perhaps have fights with our partner, as love waxes and wanes, these kinds of things create dukkha. And as we know, eventually we will be separated from them. Indeed, that's the very problem. Both of Nakula's parents, Nakula's father is concerned about being separated from his wife, and so asked the Buddha again to be what he can do to assure that he will be reborn with her in the next life. And the converse, Nakula's mother is concerned about losing her husband when he dies, and so wants to know how to retain him in the next life. This is paradigmatic clinging to one another, not wanting to lose one another, wanting to make things so that they could remain permanent. And as we know, that's not really possible. All that the Buddha can provide in this circumstance is a temporary solution. Nevertheless, the Buddha doesn't say any of this. The Buddha simply assumes that this is the kind of thing they're looking for, or it doesn't push them on it, and provides them with a kind of answer. Indeed, the Buddha says, "Householders, if wife and husband want to see each other in both this life and the next, they should be equals in faith, ethics, generosity, and wisdom." Now, this is Bhikkhu Sujato's translation over at Sutta Central. I'll leave a link to that translation down below in the notes. as I try always to do in these videos. But what I want to do is go through these four aspects, these four things that the Buddha says that that Nakula's parents should practice. The first, Bhikkhu Sujato translates as faith. I think a better translation in context would be confidence, because we're not talking about a sort of a blind faith in the Dharma or in the Buddha himself as a teacher. Rather, we're talking about confidence in the teachings, understanding their importance, seeing that they are useful to us, that they make our lives better, and having that confidence and retaining it is a very important first step towards actually practicing properly. The second point that the Buddha makes is what Bhikkhu Sujato translates as ethics. This could be understood as, very simply, as the 5 precepts, which some of us will have heard. These 5 sort of basic methods of behaving well in the world: not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying, and not abusing intoxicants, in particular alcohol. This is sort of the baseline Buddhist practice, especially in the early texts. But I think in a broader sense, this ethical idea or ideal may be that the Buddha is recommending that they pursue kindness. Kindness towards one another, kindness towards others, that they pursue a path of compassion. That is to say, wanting to help when people are suffering, both in the case of their spouses and in the case of the broader world. The third point is generosity. This is a key point for early Buddhism. The Buddha began basically all of his talks to broad lay audiences by extolling the benefits of generosity. Generosity, of course, is the opposite of stinginess. It's the sort of thing that allows us to stop clinging to things that we perceive as ours, but rather to use our wealth to make the world a better place by spreading it around to others, by donating to worthy causes. And of course, perhaps the most important worthy cause to the Buddha would have been the Buddha's Sangha itself. Now, to an extent, this would be self-serving, and then, in other words, the Buddha is, to an extent, saying, be generous to me as a teacher, but that's only part of the generosity here. One can be generous to anyone. Now, the fourth and final point is one of wisdom. Now, what would the Buddha have meant about wisdom? Most famously, wisdom in early Buddhism involves an insight into the 3 factors or natures of existence. That is to say that existence is always changing, that there is nothing permanent that we can experience, that existence is always unsatisfactory in ordinary life. Why is that? Because we're clinging to things. And the third point about existence is that it's non-self, that is, insofar as we identify ourselves with aspects of our lives, with concepts that we have, none of them are really and truly who we are. Who we are, insofar as it's anything, is something always changing. Now, highlighting these 3 features of wisdom makes clear, I think, the Buddha's pragmatism in his teaching. Because it's clear that insofar as the Buddha is giving Nakula's parents advice on being reborn together, he is in a sense giving them advice that is a little bit at odds with this kind of wisdom that I've just mentioned. Because if we really truly understand that all things change, then we'll know that the Buddha's response here to Nakula's parents is only a temporary response. It's not a permanent solution, as enlightenment is supposed to be. It certainly doesn't take account of the true unsatisfactory nature of life, because it involves more clinging to aspects of life, in particular clinging to one's romantic spouse. And I have to admit that I myself am in the same situation. I have a spouse, I love my spouse, I don't want to lose her, it's this kind of thing. So I'm not trying to say that Nakula's parents are terrible people. They're very normal people. The point is that the Buddha was willing to meet them where they were and to help them work through their particular problem with an eye towards the near future rather than the far future. In any event, at the end of the sutta, the Buddha speaks a number of verses. What he says is this: "When both are confident and charitable, disciplined, living righteously, then wife and husband speak dearly to each other. They gain many benefits, so they live at ease. Their enemies are downhearted when both are equal in virtue. Having practiced the teaching here, both equal in virtues and observances, they delight in the heavenly realm, enjoying sensual pleasures." Now, there are several things to notice about this passage. I think most importantly, it is unapologetically a worldly teaching. The Buddha is saying that by behaving well, Nakula's parents will, he says, receive many benefits. This almost certainly means many worldly benefits. That is to say, by behaving well, and this is something the Buddha says in other suttas, so this is not at all in opposition to other things the Buddha has said elsewhere, but that by behaving ethically, they have the potential to gain worldly wealth. They have the potential to live a longer life by, again, behaving well, by not injuring other people, by being kind, by being compassionate. They have an ability to be reborn into a better next life, indeed to a heavenly life. If we take the literal traditional understanding here, then the Buddha is saying that they will indeed not only have great benefits in this life, but they will be able to, indeed he says specifically, obtain great sensual pleasures in the next life by living the lives of essentially deities of one kind or another. Now, some of us may be unsure about the literal existence of such heaven or hell realms, and so may not really know what to do about these recommendations of the Buddha. But I think the Buddha's recommendations carry just as well within a lifetime as between lifetimes. That is to say, if we want to live a good life, lay life, a good householder life here, a good normal life here with our spouse, then what better way is there to do that than by being ethical, being generous, being kind, being confident in our practices of these kinds of ethical, along this ethical journey, we might say. And what better way is there for us to remain together with our spouse than to be, at least as far as we can be, kind and compassionate to one another? Now, I think in the verse at the end here, the Buddha talks about speaking kindly to one another, speaking dearly to one another. And of course, that is very important. However, I would add that it is also important to be aware of our own anger towards our spouse, because there are going to be times when we're not necessarily going to be speaking completely dearly to our spouse, when we're going to get angry, we're going to get snippy, we have disagreements on things. This is absolutely normal. And I think, speaking with the hat of a sort of I guess somebody who's been around a little bit, is that, I think a healthy life together with another person does involve our being aware of times of irritation and anger and disagreement so that we can work through them together rather than trying to pretend that such anger doesn't exist by covering them over with a kind of a false cover of kindness and dearness to one another. I think that latter way is not really going to work. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind here that the Buddha doesn't discuss, but I think that we ought to keep in mind. Now, another if we're interested in these kinds of issues of lay people in the Buddha's day, and the importance of them, and the importance of the Buddha's teaching to lay people, perhaps one of the most prominent lay people was Anathapindika, the great donor, the great lay donor to the early Sangha. And I did an earlier video on Anathapindika, this great donor, and I will leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or want to refresh your memory. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and seeing if you want to be a lay donor to the work that we're doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.